The leather seats of the black Tesla Model S felt like ice against Rachel Martinez's skin as she pulled into the rundown Shell station on Van Buren Street. The GPS had led her here after her usual Scottsdale route home was blocked by construction, forcing her into a part of Phoenix she'd forgotten existed. At 29, Rachel commanded a $3.2 billion empire from her glass tower downtown. But tonight she sat stranded in her electric vehicle with a dead battery and a cell phone that had chosen the worst possible moment to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd revolutionized clean energy storage couldn't charge her own car. Her Horizon Technologies had partnerships with every major automaker. Yet here she was, helpless in a neighborhood where her monthly car payment could cover someone's rent for a year. The contrast felt like a slap across her perfectly made-up face. She stepped out into the desert evening, her Louboutin heels clicking against cracked asphalt that had seen better decades. The smell hit her immediately, a mixture of gasoline, fried food from the attached convenience store, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Desperation, maybe. Her tailored Armani blazer felt ridiculous here, marking her as clearly out of place as a peacock in a parking lot full of pigeons. The gas station buzzed with the kind of life she'd insulated herself from. Pickup trucks with paint jobs held together by prayer and determination. Families cramming into sedans that had seen more miles than most people saw countries. Workers still in their uniforms from jobs that paid by the hour instead of by the stock option. Rachel approached the convenience store, hoping they'd have a phone charger or at least let her call an Uber. The automatic doors wheezed, open with a sound that suggested they were fighting for their mechanical lives. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered over shelves stocked with the kind of food her nutritionist had trained her to avoid. Everything seemed coated in a thin layer of resignation. Behind the bulletproof glass partition sat a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. His name tag read Kevin, and his expression read, "I don't get paid enough for this." Rachel approached the counter with the confidence that had carried her through boardroom battles with men twice her age. But something about this place made her feel smaller. Before she could speak, the door chimed again, and Rachel turned to see a man and a little girl entering. The man was tall, maybe 6'1", with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from actual work instead of expensive skincare. His jeans had honest dirt on them, and his flannel shirt was faded from washing, not from some designer's attempt to look authentic. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, brown and kind, with lines around them that spoke of someone who smiled more than he had reason to. The little girl beside him had dark curls that bounced as she walked and eyes that seemed too wise for someone who couldn't be older than 7. She wore a purple dress that had been carefully mended at the pas, hem and light-up sneakers that flashed with each step. There was something about her that made Rachel's chest tighten unexpectedly. The man approached the counter with obvious reluctance, pulling a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket. Rachel noticed how he held it, like it was precious, like it might be the last one he'd see for a while. His fingers were calloused, the kind that came from real labor, and there was a small scar across his knuckles that looked like it had a story. "Hey, Kevin," the man said, his voice warm despite the weariness around his eyes. "Can I get 20 on pump 4? Kevin nodded, taking the bill with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd handled thousands of similar transactions. But Rachel noticed something else. The man's wallet, when he'd pulled out the 20, had been empty except for what looked like a few ones and some change. This wasn't just money he was spending. This was probably money he needed. "Daddy," the little girl tugged on his sleeve. "We forgot milk again." The man's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Rachel watched him glance toward the refrigerated section, where a gallon of milk sat, with a price tag that probably represented A difficult choice between necessities. He knelt down to his daughter's level, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll get milk tomorrow, sweetheart. Tonight we'll have cereal with orange juice like we're fancy people at a hotel." The little girl giggled, and Rachel felt something twist in her stomach. The easy way he turned disappointment into adventure. The practiced cheerfulness that spoke of someone who'd had to explain why they couldn't have things before. It was a window into a world she'd forgotten existed. Rachel had grown up with want. Real want. The kind that kept you awake at night, wondering if the lights would still work in the morning. But that felt like someone else's life now, separated from her current reality by more than just money. It was separated by years of insulation, of assistants and drivers and people whose job it was to make sure she never had to think about empty wallets or choosing between milk and gas. But watching this father and daughter, something cracked open inside her chest. Maybe it was the way he touched the little girl's hair, so gentle and protective. Maybe it was the quiet dignity with which he handled his situation, refusing to let his daughter feel the weight of their circumstances. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that felt like recognition. "Excuse me," Rachel heard herself saying before she'd fully decided to speak. The man looked up, surprised, and Rachel felt the full force of his attention. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just brown but had flecks of gold, and they were studying her with obvious confusion. "I couldn't help but overhear," she continued, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop. "I'm actually having car trouble myself, and I was wondering if you could help me." It wasn't entirely a lie. Her car was dead, even if the solution was simpler than what she was implying. But something about this moment felt important, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing whether to jump. The man straightened, and Rachel could see him taking in her appearance, the expensive clothes, the manicured nails, the obvious signs of wealth. But instead of resentment or calculation, she saw only concern. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, already moving toward the door. "I'm not much of a mechanic, but I can take a look." Rachel followed him outside, the little girl skipping beside them, her light-up shoes creating a disco effect against the darkening asphalt. The evening air carried the scent of creosote and distant rain, promising one of those desert storms that could transform the landscape in minutes. There, Rachel pointed to her Tesla, which looked like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong decade. The man whistled low, a sound of appreciation rather than intimidation. "That's a beautiful car," he said simply, walking around it with the careful attention of someone who understood machinery even if he couldn't afford it. "What's she doing to you?" Rachel found herself explaining the dead battery, the failed phone, the unexpected detour that had brought her here. As she talked, she watched him listen with the kind of focused attention that had become rare in her world. No checking of phones, no glancing at watches, just complete presence. "Well," he said after examining the charging port, "I don't have the kind of cable you'd need for this, but there's a 24-hour garage about 2 miles up Van Buren. They might have what you need, or at least let you use their phone." 2 miles, Rachel repeated, looking down at her heels, then up at the darkening sky. "I could give you a ride," he offered, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, if you're comfortable with that. I know how it looks, stranger offering rides and all, but I've got Lily with me, and she's better character reference than any background check." The little girl beamed up at Rachel, and something about her smile made Rachel's throat tight. "I'm Lily Thompson," she announced with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd been raised to believe she mattered. "My daddy's the nicest person in the whole world, except for maybe Mr. Chun, who gives me extra fortune cookies." "David Thompson," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "And she's not biased at all." "Rachel," she replied, taking his hand and feeling the strength in it, the honesty. She'd called her assistant Elena to cancel her dinner meeting, claiming car trouble, though the real trouble was the storm brewing in her chest. Something about David Thompson and his daughter had unsettled her in ways she couldn't name. Rachel Martinez hadn't always lived in glass towers and leather-seated luxury. 29 felt ancient when she remembered that just 7 years ago, she'd been sleeping on a friend's couch, pregnant and alone, with nothing but a computer science degree and a head full of impossible dreams. The journey from that broken girl to the woman Forbes called the clean energy visionary had been paved with 18-hour days, venture capital meetings where she was the only woman in rooms full of men who spoke to her chest instead of her face, and a determination forged in fire. But tonight, watching David count out his last $20 with the careful precision of someone who knew the weight of every penny, she'd been transported back to those days when she understood that arithmetic of survival. She remembered standing in grocery store aisles, calculator in hand, choosing between milk and bread, between electricity and gas, between dignity and necessity. The pregnancy had been unplanned, unwanted by everyone except Rachel herself. The father, a venture capitalist twice her age who'd made pretty promises about mentorship and partnership, had disappeared the moment she'd told him about the baby. His final words to her still echoed in quiet moments. "I invest in futures, not mistakes." Her own father, Robert Martinez, had been even crueler. A self-made man who'd built a construction empire from nothing, he'd seen her pregnancy as a betrayal of everything he'd sacrificed to give her opportunities. "You had Harvard lined up," he'd raged, pacing the marble floors of his Scottsdale mansion. "You had internships at Google waiting. And you threw it all away for some man who won't even return your calls." The fight that followed had been nuclear. Words that couldn't be taken back, ultimatums that couldn't be negotiated. Her father had been clear: terminate the pregnancy and resume the life he'd planned for her, or lose his support entirely. When Rachel had chosen her unborn daughter, Robert Martinez had made good on his threat. Cut off from family money, evicted from the apartment her father had been paying for, Rachel had learned the weight of independence at its heaviest. She'd moved into a studio apartment in Tempe that smelled like previous tenants' cooking and broken dreams. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' arguments, their celebrations, their late-night tears that sometimes matched her own. Working at a call center during the day and teaching herself advanced coding at night, Rachel had felt her daughter growing strong inside her, even as her own body grew weak from stress and poor nutrition. She'd talk to her belly constantly, promising a future that seemed impossible from her current vantage point. "We're going to build something amazing, little star," she'd whispered during those long nights when insomnia and pregnancy hormones kept sleep at bay. "We're going to show them all what we're capable of." She'd named her daughter Sophia before. She was born after her grandmother who'd immigrated from Mexico with nothing but fierce hope and calloused hands. Sophia Martinez would be born into struggle, but she'd also be born into love that didn't depend on bank accounts or social status. The contractions had started during a particularly brutal Arizona summer, the kind of heat that made air conditioning a necessity rather than a luxury. Rachel's ancient window unit had given up the fight 2 days earlier, and she'd been using frozen vegetables as ice packs, while timing pains that seemed determined to rearrange her understanding of what her body could endure. She'd driven herself to Phoenix General Hospital in a Honda Civic that threatened to overheat in the parking lot. No birthing coach, no carefully packed hospital bag with organic baby clothes and artisanal blankets. Just a scared 22-year-old, with a hospital gown that had seen better decades and dreams bigger than her current circumstances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rachel Martinez. If the name meant anything to him, he didn't show it. In her world, introducing herself usually led to recognition, to the subtle shift in behavior that came when people realized they were talking to someone worth $3 billion. But David Thompson just smiled and opened the passenger door of his pickup truck with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that felt like time travel. The interior of the truck was clean but worn, with a booster seat in the back where Lily climbed with practiced ease. The radio was stuck on a country station, playing something about heartbreak and highway miles. David reached to change it, but Rachel stopped him. "It's fine," she said, settling into the passenger seat that had probably seen more honest miles than her Tesla had seen careful ones. As they pulled out of the gas station, Rachel caught sight of herself in the side mirror. Her perfectly styled hair was still perfect, her makeup still flawless, but something in her eyes looked different. Softer maybe, or more awake. She couldn't remember the last time she'd sat in a truck, couldn't remember the last time someone had offered to help her without wanting something in return. "So what do you do, Rachel?" David asked as they navigated the evening traffic, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the calculating interest she was used to. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rachel Martinez, CEO of Horizon Technologies, worth more money than most people could count, owner of patents that had revolutionized entire industries. But sitting in this truck, with the smell of honest work and the sound of a little girl humming in the back seat, those accomplishments felt both enormous and completely irrelevant. "I work in technology," she said finally, which was true if incomplete. The labor had been long and complicated. 26 hours of pain that redefined every measurement she'd ever used for difficulty. But when Sophia finally arrived, screaming and perfect and impossibly tiny, Rachel had felt something click into place in the universe. This was why she'd endured everything. This was what love looked like when it chose you instead of the other way around. Sophia had weighed 5 pounds 2 ounces, with dark hair that stood up in impossible directions, and eyes that seemed to focus on Rachel's face with startling intensity. "Hello, little star," Rachel had whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "I'm your mama, and we're going to change the world together." The pediatric nurse who'd taken Sophia for routine testing had been kind. A middle-aged woman with gentle hands and the kind of voice that made scared new mothers feel less alone. "She's beautiful," the nurse had said. "Strong lungs, good reflexes. You did good, Mama." Rachel had dozed fitfully, Sophia sleeping in the bassinet beside her bed, both of them recovering from the marathon of birth. The hospital room was small and utilitarian, but it felt like a palace because it contained everything that mattered. Her daughter was healthy, Rachel was healing, and they had each other. She'd awakened to chaos. Alarms blaring, nurses rushing, Sophia's bassinet empty. Through the fog of post-delivery medication and exhaustion, Rachel had tried to understand what was happening. Sophia had stopped breathing. The pediatric team was working on her. There were complications they hadn't anticipated. "Where is she?" Rachel had screamed, trying to get out of bed despite the protests of her healing body. "I need to see her. I need to be with her." But the medical team had been focused entirely on their tiny patient, and Rachel had been relegated to the sidelines of her own worst nightmare. She'd heard fragments through the controlled chaos. Respiratory distress, cardiac irregularities. "We're doing everything we can." The next 12 hours had passed in a haze of waiting room chairs and vending machine coffee, of calling Sophia's name into empty hallways and bargaining with whatever cosmic forces might be listening. Rachel had offered everything she could think of. Her future success, her own life, her ability to ever feel happy again. Just bring Sophia back. Just let her breathe. When the doctor had finally emerged, his expression had told the story before. His words could. Despite their best efforts, despite every intervention available, Sophia Martinez had lost her fight at 6 hours old. Her heart, which had been perfect during every prenatal checkup, had developed an arrhythmia that their equipment couldn't stabilize. "I'm sorry," the doctor had said, words that Rachel heard as if they were coming from underwater. "We did everything medically possible." Sometimes these things happen despite our best efforts. Rachel had demanded to see her daughter, but the medical team had been hesitant. It might be better to remember her as she was, a social worker had suggested gently. Sometimes seeing them afterward can make the grieving process more difficult. But Rachel had insisted, and finally they'd brought Sophia to her, wrapped in a hospital blanket that made her look even smaller than she'd been in life. Rachel had held her daughter for the last time, memorizing every perfect feature, singing lullabies to ears that would never hear them again. The funeral arrangements had been a blur of decisions that felt simultaneously crucial and meaningless. Rachel had chosen a tiny white casket and a cemetery plot that cost more than she'd made in 3 months. She'd written a eulogy for a life that had lasted less than a day, but had changed everything about her own. Standing at that graveside, holding a single white rose and watching them lower Sophia into the ground, Rachel had felt something fundamental shift inside her. The grief was overwhelming, but underneath it was something harder and more dangerous. Rage at the cosmic unfairness that had taken her daughter. Rage at a medical system that had been helpless when it mattered most. Rage at her father, who hadn't even acknowledged Sophia's existence, let alone her death. But mostly rage at herself for not being able to save the one person who had mattered more than breathing. She'd used that rage like fuel, channeling it into code that ran for days without sleep, algorithms that attacked the problem of infant mortality from angles no one had considered before. If the medical establishment couldn't save babies like Sophia, then Rachel would build technology that could. Working 18-hour days in her tiny apartment, surviving on energy drinks and determination, Rachel had developed a monitoring system that could detect cardiac irregularities in newborns hours before traditional methods. Her prototype was crude, built from parts she'd scavenged and software she'd written in languages she'd taught herself, but it worked. The first hospital to test her system had been skeptical. A grieving mother with no medical training, no business experience, no funding beyond what she could scrape together from freelance coding jobs. But the technology spoke for itself. In 6 months of testing, Rachel's system had identified 12 cases of cardiac distress that might have gone undetected until it was too late. Those 12 babies had lived because Sophia had died. It was a trade Rachel would have reversed in a heartbeat, but it was also a purpose that kept her breathing when grief threatened to stop her heart entirely. The venture capital meetings had been brutal at first. Rooms full of men in expensive suits who questioned everything from her technical knowledge to her emotional stability. "Are you sure you're ready for this level of responsibility?" they'd ask, as if the responsibility of building a business could somehow exceed the responsibility of keeping a daughter alive. But Rachel had learned to speak their language too. Present her grief as market opportunity, her daughter's death as proof of concept. She'd worn Sophia's hospital bracelet to every meeting, a talisman that reminded her why she was fighting and what she was fighting for. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Sarah Chun, head of neonatal care at Phoenix Children's Hospital, had agreed to champion Rachel's technology. Dr. Chun had lost her own child to sudden infant death syndrome and understood that sometimes the most important innovations came from the deepest pain. "Your system could revolutionize neonatal care," Dr. Chun had told Rachel during their first meeting. "But more than that, it could save families from experiencing what we've both been through." With Dr. Chun's endorsement, funding had followed. First hundreds of thousands, then millions, then amounts that made Rachel's earlier poverty feel like someone else's life entirely. Horizon Technologies had grown from a one-woman operation in a studio apartment to a company employing hundreds of people across 3 continents. But success hadn't filled the Sophia-shaped hole in Rachel's life. If anything, it had made the emptiness more pronounced. She lived in a penthouse that echoed with silence, drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, wore clothes that had been handmade by artisans whose names she'd never learned. Every milestone felt hollow without someone to share it with. When Horizon had gone public, Rachel had stood on the trading floor and watched her company's value climb into the billions, but the person she'd most wanted to call was 7 years. Dead and buried in a cemetery she visited every week with fresh flowers and updates on the lives her technology had saved. Tonight, driving home from the garage in her recharged Tesla, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about David Thompson and his daughter, Lily. Something about the little girl had felt familiar in a way that made Rachel's chest tight with recognition. She couldn't name. The way Lily had looked at her with those old soul eyes that seemed to see past surface to something deeper. And David himself had stirred something in Rachel that she'd thought was permanently dormant. "Just trying to build something better for her," he said, glancing toward Lily with an expression of pure love. "She deserves more than living paycheck to paycheck." "Daddy's really smart," Lily announced proudly. "He helps me with math homework, even when the numbers get really big. And he knows all the constellations and tells me stories about them when we can't sleep." Rachel found herself smiling despite the growing ache in her chest. "What's your favorite constellation, Lily?" "Cassiopeia," Lily replied without hesitation. "Because it looks like a woody, and that's the first letter of wish. Daddy says if you make a wish on Cassiopeia, it has to come true because it's the queen of all the stars." The words hit Rachel like cold water. She'd written something similar in a journal during her pregnancy about wishing on stars and believing in magic for her unborn daughter. But that was impossible. Lily couldn't know about private thoughts she'd never shared with anyone. "That's a beautiful story," Rachel managed, her voice slightly unsteady. "We should probably get going," David said, checking his watch. "I can't be late, and Mrs. Chun worries if Lily isn't there by her usual time." Rachel nodded, stepping back from the truck, but something made her hesitate. "David, can I ask you something?" He waited, patient despite his obvious need to leave. "Last night, when I asked for help, you didn't even think about it. You just offered. In my experience, people usually want to know what's in it for them." First, David considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I learned early that we're all just trying to get through the day intact. If I can make someone's day a little easier, maybe someone will do the same for Lily when she needs it. It's not charity, it's just community, I suppose." The simplicity of his worldview, the foundational decency that seemed to guide his decisions, made Rachel feel simultaneously inspired and ashamed. When was the last time she'd helped someone without calculating the potential return? When had she last seen a stranger's need as an opportunity to be useful rather than a problem to be solved by writing a check? "Thank you," she said quietly, "for reminding me that there are still good people in the world." As David's truck pulled away, Lily's face appeared in the rear window again, her small hand pressed against the glass in a wave that seemed to last forever. Rachel stood in the apartment complex parking lot, watching until they disappeared around a corner, feeling like something important had just walked out of her life. The drive back to her office should have been routine, but Rachel found herself taking the long way, thinking about David's words and Lily's star stories. She'd built an empire on the principle that everything had a price, that every problem could be solved with enough money and determination. But David Thompson seemed to operate from an entirely different framework, one where kindness was currency and community was capital. Back at Horizon Technologies, surrounded by glass and steel and the hum of servers processing algorithms that had made her billions, Rachel felt disconnected from her own success in a way that was becoming increasingly familiar. Her corner office offered a panoramic view of Phoenix, but from 40 stories up, people looked like insects and problems seemed abstract rather than immediate. Alina knocked on her door at 5:30, carrying the stack of contracts and quarterly reports that usually consumed Rachel's evenings. But tonight, the numbers and projections felt meaningless compared to the memory of David's empty wallet and Lily's light-up shoes. "Cancel my dinner with the Japanese investors," Rachel heard herself saying. "Reschedule the board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. And Elena?" I need you to research something for me. Elena raised an eyebrow, pen poised over her tablet. In 5 years of working together, Rachel had never canceled meetings with potential billion-dollar partners. I want to know everything about infant mortality rates in Arizona hospitals, particularly cardiac-related deaths in newborns. I want to know which facilities have the best survival rates and which ones are struggling. And I want to know about children who've been lost in the system, adoption cases that might have paperwork irregularities. That's quite a departure from clean energy research, Elena observed carefully. Is this related to a new initiative? Rachel stared out her window at the city below, thinking about a little girl who knew about star wishes and a man who'd spent his last $20 helping a stranger. Maybe, she said. Or maybe it's about time I remembered why I started this company in the first place. Elena nodded and left to begin her research, but Rachel remained at her window long after the sun had set and the city lights had begun to twinkle like earthbound stars. Somewhere out there, David was beginning his night shift, keeping watch over other people's property while Mrs. Chun watched over his most precious possession. Somewhere out there, Lily was probably doing homework or drawing pictures or talking to her invisible friends about constellation wishes. And somewhere in the space between Rachel's penthouse isolation and their modest apartment warmth, a truth was beginning to emerge that would challenge everything she thought she knew about family, loss, and the mysterious ways that love finds its way back to where it belongs. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Preliminary research complete. Found some interesting irregularities in hospital records from 7 years ago. Are you looking for anything specific? Rachel's fingers hovered over her phone, and for a moment she considered calling off the investigation entirely. Some stones were better left unturned, some questions better left unasked. But the image of Lily's knowing eyes, the way the little girl had looked at her like she was trying to solve a puzzle, made the decision for her. Everything, Rachel typed back. I want to know everything. Because somewhere in her gut, in the place where maternal instinct lived even after 7 years of dormancy, Rachel Martinez was beginning to suspect that everything she'd been told about that night at Phoenix General Hospital might not have been the complete truth. And if there was even the smallest possibility that she'd been lied to about the most important moment of her life, then no amount of money or power would stop her from uncovering what really happened to her daughter. Elena's research had taken 3 days to compile, and the manila folder she placed on Rachel's desk felt heavier than it should have. Rachel stared at it for a long moment, coffee growing cold in her hand, knowing that whatever was inside might change everything she thought she knew about the worst night of her life. The hospital records from 7 years ago, Elena said quietly, settling into the chair across from Rachel's desk. There are some inconsistencies that I think you need to see. Rachel opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were photocopies of medical charts, birth certificates, death certificates, and adoption paperwork. Elena had organized everything chronologically, starting with Rachel's admission to Phoenix General Hospital on the night Sophia was born. Tell me what you found, Rachel said, her voice steadier than she felt. Elena pulled out a highlighted document. This is your daughter's birth certificate. Sophia Martinez, born March 15th at 11:42 p.m., weight 5 pounds 2 ounces, but look at this. She placed another paper beside it. This is the death certificate filed the same night. Time of death listed as 6:15 a.m. the following morning. Rachel studied the papers, seeing her own signature on the birth certificate. Shaky from exhaustion and medication, but definitely hers. The death certificate bore the signature of Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending physician who delivered the devastating news. I don't understand, Rachel said. What's inconsistent about this? Elena placed a third document on the desk. This is an adoption certificate filed 48 hours later for a female infant, approximately the same birth weight, found abandoned at the hospital. The adopting family was Maria Santos, single mother, who died in a car accident when the child was 6 months old. The child then went into the system briefly before being adopted by David Thompson. Rachel's blood turned to ice water. David Thompson adopted a baby girl 7 years ago. His sister Jessica adopted her first, Elena corrected gently. Jessica Thompson, pediatric nurse at Phoenix General. She filed the papers, but when she died in the car accident, custody transferred to David as per her will. The room seemed to tilt around Rachel. Jessica Thompson had been a nurse at Phoenix General. The night Sophia was born, David's sister had adopted a baby girl who would now be exactly Lily's age. The coincidences were stacking up like evidence in a case she was afraid to prosecute. There's more, Elena continued, pulling out another set of documents. I cross-referenced the hospital's employee records from that night. Jessica Thompson was working in the neonatal intensive care unit. She was actually one of the nurses who would have been caring for Sophia during those critical hours. Rachel pushed back from her desk, needing space to process what she was hearing. The nurse who'd cared for Sophia had later adopted a baby found abandoned at the same hospital. That nurse's brother was now raising a little girl who seemed to recognize Rachel in ways that defied explanation. Show me everything else, Rachel demanded, her CEO voice cutting through her personal shock. Elena spread more documents across the desk. The adoption paperwork for the abandoned infant has some irregularities. There's no record of how the baby arrived at the hospital. No security footage from that night has been preserved, and the note allegedly found with the baby was never photographed for the file. What about medical records for the abandoned baby? That's where it gets really interesting, Elena said, pulling out another folder. The abandoned infant had the same rare blood type as Sophia. She had a small birthmark behind her right ear, crescent-shaped, and she had some kind of medical bracelet that had to be cut off because it was too tight. Rachel's hand flew to her own neck, where she still wore the delicate chain that had once held Sophia's hospital bracelet. She'd had it made into a necklace, a way to keep her daughter close to her heart. A medical bracelet? The records don't specify what kind, just that it had to be removed. But Rachel, there's something else. I managed to get access to the original intake photos of the abandoned baby. Elena placed a photograph on the desk, and Rachel's world stopped spinning entirely. The baby in the picture had Sophia's distinctive dark hair, the same small nose, the same perfectly formed lips. But more than that, she had the same crescent-shaped birthmark that Rachel remembered tracing with her finger during those precious few hours when Sophia had been alive. This baby looks exactly like Sophia, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. There's more, Elena said gently. I contacted some of the staff who were working that night. Most of them have moved on or retired, but I found one nurse, Margaret Collins, who remembers the situation. She agreed to meet with you if you want to hear what she has to say. Rachel stared at the photograph, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed too incredible to believe. Could Sophia have survived? Could the death certificate have been falsified? Could her daughter be alive, being raised by the very man who'd shown her kindness at a gas station? Set up the meeting, Rachel said, her voice gaining strength. I need to know what really happened that night. Margaret Collins agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in Tempe, away from the hospital and the memories that might make speaking difficult. She was in her late 50s now, with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much over the years to be easily shocked. When Rachel arrived, Margaret was already seated in a corner booth, stirring sugar into coffee with the careful attention of someone buying time. Mrs. Martinez, Margaret said as Rachel slid into the opposite seat. I've been wondering if this day would ever come. What do you mean? Margaret sighed, looking older than her years. That night has haunted me for 7 years. I've thought about reaching out to you so many times, but I wasn't sure what good it would do. Sometimes the truth hurts more than the lie. Rachel felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Please, I need to know what happened to my daughter." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then began speaking in a voice that carried the weight of long-held secrets. Sophia didn't die at 6:15 that morning. She had stopped breathing around midnight. Yes, but we got her back. Dr. Chun and I worked on her for 20 minutes, and we stabilized her. She was breathing on her own, heart rate steady, weak but alive. Rachel gripped the edge of the table. "Then why was I told she died?" "Because someone wanted you to believe she had," Margaret said quietly. About an hour after we stabilized Sophia, a man came to the NICU, well-dressed, authoritative. He said he was there on behalf of your family, that there had been decisions made about the baby's care. What kind of decisions? He had paperwork, legal documents that gave him authority to make medical decisions for Sophia. He said your family had determined that extraordinary measures shouldn't be continued, that it would be kinder to let nature take its course. Rachel felt nausea rising in her throat. My family? I don't have any family except my father, and he wanted nothing to do with Sophia. That's what I thought was strange, Margaret continued. You'd been asking about her constantly, trying to get up to see her despite doctor's orders to rest. You clearly wanted to fight for her. But this man insisted that the family had made their decision. What did he look like? Tall, silver hair, expensive suit. He had the kind of presence that made you want to do what he said. He spoke with hospital administration, and suddenly Dr. Williams was overruling Dr. Chien's treatment plan, Rachel's father. It had to be Robert Martinez, using his wealth and influence to make decisions about Sophia's life without consulting the one person who should have had the final say. Her own father had essentially stolen her daughter from her. What happened next? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Jessica Thompson was working the night shift in NICU. She'd lost her own baby 6 months earlier, stillborn at full term. She was devastated about Sophia, kept saying it wasn't right, that babies who could be saved should be saved. So she took her? Not exactly, Margaret said carefully. There was a power outage that night, just for about 30 minutes. Emergency generators kicked in for life support, but some of the monitoring systems went down. In the confusion, Sophia disappeared from the NICU. Rachel stared at Margaret, understanding dawning like a terrible sunrise. Jessica saved her. We found a note the next morning, written in block letters. Some babies choose their families. This one chose love over law. Jessica called in sick for the rest of the week, then put in for a transfer to pediatrics. When she came back, she mentioned she'd just finalized an adoption for a baby girl who'd been abandoned. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Robert Martinez had used his influence to essentially order Sophia's death, but Jessica Thompson had intervened, spiriting the baby away during the power outage and creating the fiction of an abandoned infant to protect her from whatever forces had wanted her gone. Why didn't you report this? Why didn't you tell someone? Margaret's face crumpled with 7 years of guilt. Because I was a single mother with 3 kids, and Robert Martinez was one of the hospital's biggest donors. Because Dr. Williams made it clear that asking questions about that night would be career suicide. Because Jessica seemed to genuinely love that baby, and I thought maybe that was enough. But you've regretted it, Rachel said, seeing the pain in the older woman's eyes. Every day, Margaret whispered. I've watched you on the news, seen what you've accomplished, and I've wondered if you would have wanted the chance to raise your daughter. I've wondered if I was complicit in stealing something that could never be replaced. Rachel reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. You were trying to protect your own children, I understand that. But I need to know for certain. Is Lily Thompson my daughter Sophia? I can't say for sure without DNA testing, Margaret replied. But she has Sophia's birthmark, Sophia's blood type, and Sophia's eyes. And she's being raised by the most loving man I've ever seen become a father. David Thompson worships that little girl. Rachel sat back in the booth, her mind spinning with the implications. If Lily was Sophia, then David had been unknowingly raising Rachel's biological daughter for 7 years. He'd loved her, protected her, sacrificed everything for her, believing she was his sister's adopted child. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said quietly. "Jessica left some things with me before she died. She said if anyone ever came looking for the truth about Lily's origins, I should give them this." Margaret pulled an envelope from her purse, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive power. Rachel's name was written across the front in careful handwriting. Inside the envelope was a letter, a tiny hospital bracelet, and a photograph of Sophia taken during those few hours when she'd been alive and healthy. The letter was brief but devastating. "If you're reading this, then someone has finally asked the right questions about the night that changed everything. I saved your daughter because every baby deserves a chance to be loved, and I could see in your eyes that you loved her more than life itself. I'm sorry I couldn't give her back to you, but powerful people wanted her gone, and I was just a nurse who couldn't fight a system designed to protect wealth over truth. She's safe now and loved, and that has to be enough. I pray someday you'll understand why I did what I did, and that you'll forgive me for the years you've lost. Your daughter is alive, and she's magnificent." Rachel stared at the hospital bracelet, so tiny it could barely fit around her thumb. The bracelet she'd placed on Sophia's wrist during those precious few hours they'd had together. Proof that Lily Thompson was Sophia Martinez, and that 7 years of grief had been based on a lie orchestrated by her own father. Margaret was watching her carefully. "What will you do now?" Rachel looked at the photograph of Sophia, then at the bracelet that proved her daughter was alive and living 20 minutes away with a man who'd become the father Rachel had never been allowed to be. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But first, I need to have a conversation with my father. And then I need to figure out how to tell David Thompson that the daughter he's raised and loved isn't his to keep." The truth was finally emerging, but Rachel was beginning to understand that sometimes the truth created more problems than it solved. How do you reclaim a child who's never known she was lost? How do you forgive a father who stole 7 years of your daughter's life? And how do you tell a good man that his whole world is about to change forever? The confrontation with her father took place in his Scottsdale mansion, the same house where he'd delivered his ultimatum 7 years earlier. Robert Martinez looked older now, his silver hair whiter, his shoulders carrying the weight of a construction empire that had made him one of Arizona's wealthiest men. But his eyes held the same steel that had intimidated boardrooms and broken competitors for decades. "You look successful," he said as Rachel entered his study, gesturing to her tailored suit and diamond watch. "I assume you've come to thank me for pushing you toward greatness." Rachel placed the hospital bracelet on his mahogany desk, watching his face carefully. "I've come to ask you about the night you tried to murder my daughter." Robert's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his whiskey glass. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sophia didn't die naturally," Rachel said, her voice deadly calm. "You went to the hospital and used your influence to have her life support discontinued. You told them the family had decided to let nature take its course, except you weren't her family." "I was." Robert stood and walked to his window, looking out at the landscaped grounds that his money had carved from desert wasteland. "You were 22 years old, pregnant by a man who didn't want you, with no money and no prospects. That baby would have ruined any chance you had at a real life." "That baby was my daughter," Rachel shot back, standing as well. "She had a name. Sophia. She was alive and you decided she shouldn't be." "And look what you accomplished without that burden," Robert said, turning to face her. $3 billion, Forbes covers, technology that's changing the world. Would you have built any of that while changing diapers and worrying about daycare? Rachel felt rage building in her chest like a wildfire. "You don't get to make that choice for me. You don't get to decide what my life should look like or what burdens I can handle. I saved you from a mistake that would have cost you everything. Robert insisted. That baby would have trapped you in poverty, tied you to a life of struggling and scraping just to survive. Instead, you became someone who matters. She mattered, Rachel screamed, all her corporate composure finally cracking. She was my child, and she mattered more than any of this. She gestured around the opulent study at the evidence of wealth that had been purchased with her daughter's life. Robert's face hardened into the expression that had terrified her. As a child, don't be naive, Rachel. Love doesn't pay bills or build empires. That baby would have been an anchor around your neck, pulling you down into mediocrity. Sophia is alive, Rachel said quietly, watching her father's reaction carefully. Your plan failed. Someone saved her, and she's been living 20 minutes from here for 7 years. For the first time, Robert Martinez looked genuinely shaken. His whiskey glass trembled in his hand before he set it down with deliberate care. That's impossible. The death certificate was filed. The cremation was handled. The cremation of an empty coffin, Rachel clarified. While you were arranging paperwork, a nurse was saving my daughter's life. Sophia has been living as Lily Thompson, raised by a man who's given her more love and attention than you ever gave me. Robert sank into his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. If this is true, then you have a problem. Legally, that man has been her father for 7 years. He has adoption papers, custody agreements. You have no claim to her. I have DNA, Rachel said coldly. I have hospital records, witness testimony, and evidence of fraud. But, more than that, I have something you never understood. I have love that doesn't depend on conditions or achievements. What do you want from me? Robert asked, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. I want you to stay away from her. Away from both of them. And I want you to understand that. You're not her grandfather. You gave up that right when you tried to kill her. Rachel left her father's house feeling simultaneously vindicated and hollow. 7 years of grief had been validated, but the knowledge couldn't restore the years she'd lost or erase the damage that had been done. The hardest conversation still lay ahead. She found David at the apartment complex that evening, helping Lily with homework at a small table in their living room. Through the window, Rachel could see them bent over math problems, David's patient voice explaining concepts while Lily chewed on her pencil with the intense concentration of someone determined to understand. When Rachel knocked, David answered with surprise that quickly shifted to concern. He was still in his work clothes, grease on his hands from some mechanical task, but his attention was immediately focused on her obvious distress. Rachel? Is everything okay? I need to talk to you, she said, glancing toward Lily, who had looked up from her homework with those unervingly perceptive eyes. It's important. David must have heard something in her tone because he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. They walked to a small courtyard where children's voices provided background noise for the conversation that would change everything. 7 years ago, Rachel began, her hands shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. I gave birth to a daughter at Phoenix General Hospital. I was told she died from cardiac complications when she was 6 hours old. David listened quietly, his expression growing more concerned as Rachel continued. She didn't die, Rachel said, pulling out the photograph Margaret had given her. She was saved by your sister Jessica during a power outage. Jessica took her and created the fiction of an abandoned baby to protect her from people who wanted her gone. David stared at the photograph, and Rachel watched understanding dawn across his features like sunrise over desert mountains. The baby in the picture looked exactly like Lily had at that age, down to the distinctive birthmark and the serious expression that suggested an old soul in a tiny body. You're saying that Lily is your biological daughter, David said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. I'm saying that Sophia Martinez became Lily Thompson the night your sister saved her life, Rachel confirmed. The bracelet that had to be cut off her wrist when she was 1? I put it there during the few hours I thought I had with her before she died. David sank onto a concrete bench, the photograph trembling in his hands. Jessica never told me any of this. She said Lily was abandoned, that someone had left her with just a note asking people to love her. Jessica was protecting all of you, Rachel said gently. She knew that powerful people had wanted Sophia gone, and she probably thought keeping the secret would keep Lily safe. Powerful people, David repeated, looking up at Rachel with new understanding. Your father. Rachel nodded, explaining about Robert Martinez's intervention, about the falsified death certificate and the conspiracy that had stolen 7 years of her daughter's life. David listened with the focused attention of someone processing information. That redefined everything he thought he knew about his world. What does this mean? David asked finally. What are you going to do? Rachel had been dreading this question because she honestly didn't know the answer. Legally, I could probably fight for custody. I have DNA evidence, witness testimony, proof of fraud. But David, you've been her father for 7 years. You've loved her, raised her, sacrificed everything for her. I can't just take her away from that. But she's your daughter, David said quietly. You lost 7 years with her because of something you had no control over. Don't you want those years back? I want what's best for Lily, Rachel replied. And what's best for her is having both of us in her life. You've given her stability, love, a foundation of security that money can't buy. I can give her opportunities, education, a future without financial stress. But together, we could give her everything. David was quiet for a long moment, watching children play in the courtyard while processing the impossible situation they found themselves in. Are you talking about some kind of custody arrangement? I'm talking about becoming a family, Rachel said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Not traditional, maybe, but real. Lily loves you, David. That's not going to change because we've discovered the truth about her origins. And I care about both of you more than I expected to. You care about us, David repeated, and Rachel heard something in his voice that might have been hope. I've spent 7 years believing my daughter was dead, Rachel said. I built an empire on grief and rage, thinking that success could somehow fill the hole she left behind. But meeting you, seeing how you've raised her, watching the way you love her without conditions or expectations, it's shown me what I've been missing. David stood and walked a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, shoulders tense with the weight of decisions that would affect all their futures. What about the practical things? She's used to living here, going to the neighborhood school, having Mrs. Chun babysit. She's never known wealth or privilege. Then we don't change what's working, Rachel said simply. I can move closer, be part of her daily routine instead of disrupting it. I can help with expenses without making you feel like charity. I can be her mother without trying to replace you as her father. And us? David asked, turning to face her. What happens between us in all this? Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past week, her feelings for David had grown from gratitude to genuine affection, to something deeper that she was afraid to name. He was everything she'd forgotten men could be. Honest, gentle, strong without needing to prove it, devoted to something more important than himself. I'd like to find out, she admitted. I know this is complicated, and I know we're from different worlds. But David, you've shown me what real love looks like. Not love that depends on success or achievement, but love that just is. I'd like to learn how to be that kind of person. Before David could respond, the apartment door opened and Lily emerged, looking for her father with the impatience of a 7-year-old who'd been left alone too long. But when she saw Rachel, her expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. I thought you might be my real mom, Lily said with the directness that only children possessed. I kept dreaming about a lady who looked like you, who smelled like you, who cried about losing me. And when I saw you at the gas station, it felt like coming home." Rachel knelt down to Lily's level, tears streaming down her face. "How did you?" "No, I don't know," Lily replied, reaching out to touch Rachel's cheek with the gentle curiosity of someone confirming a long-held suspicion. "I just felt it. Like when you know it's going to rain even though the sky is still blue." You upset?" Rachel asked, afraid of the answer. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "I'm happy," she said finally, "because now I have a daddy and a mama, and we can all be together, like a real family." "It might be complicated," David warned gently. "Adults have to figure out legal things, and there might be difficult conversations ahead." "Adults always make things complicated," Lily said with the wisdom of someone who'd observed grown-ups for 7 years. "But love isn't complicated. Love just is." 6 months later, Rachel sat in the backyard of the house she'd bought in David's neighborhood, watching her daughter teach her new baby brother how to stack blocks while David grilled dinner on a barbecue. That had come with the house. It wasn't the mansion she could have afforded, but it was home in a way her penthouse had never been. The legal battles had been resolved with surprising ease once Robert Martinez had decided not to fight the revelations about Sophia's survival. Perhaps guilt had finally caught up with him, or perhaps he'd realized that fighting would only bring more attention to his role in the conspiracy. Either way, he'd quietly removed himself from their lives, leaving Rachel free to build the family she'd always wanted. The wedding had been small, held in the same courtyard where Rachel had confessed the truth about Lily's origins. Elena had served as maid of honor, Mrs. Chun had provided flowers from her garden, and Lily had walked down the makeshift aisle carrying rings and wearing a dress that perfectly matched her light-up shoes. "I have something for you," Rachel said to Lily as the little girl abandoned her blocks in favor of climbing into Rachel's lap. She pulled out a small jewelry box containing a delicate bracelet, sized perfectly for a 7-year-old wrist. "It's beautiful," Lily breathed, holding up her arm so Rachel could fasten the clasp. "What does it say?" "Sophia," Rachel replied, watching her daughter trace the engraved letters with careful fingers. "It's your first name, your real name. The name I gave you when you were born." "Sophia Lily Thompson Martinez," Lily said, testing how it sounded. "That's a lot of names for one person." "That's because you have a lot of people who love you," David said, joining them on the porch swing with the baby gurgling contentedly in his arms. "Each name represents someone who chose you, someone who fought for you, someone who couldn't imagine life without you." Rachel leaned against David's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had anchored both her and Lily through the storms of discovery and change. Their love story hadn't been conventional, but it had been real in ways that surprised her with their depth. "Tell me the star story again," Lily requested, settling more comfortably in Rachel's lap while David adjusted the baby's blanket. "Once upon a time," Rachel began, the ritual they'd established over months of bedtime stories and quiet evenings, "there was a little star that got lost in the darkness. She wandered for years, looking for where she belonged, until one night she saw the lights of home and followed them back to the people who'd been wishing for her return. And they all lived happily ever after," Lily finished with satisfaction. "They all lived together," Rachel corrected gently, "which is better than happily ever after, because it's real." As the Arizona sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rachel Martinez Thompson watched her husband teach their son to wave while their daughter drew pictures of their family with chalk on the sidewalk. The life she'd built wasn't the one she'd planned, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes the best gifts came disguised as strangers at gas stations, she thought, remembering that night when David had spent his last $20 helping someone he didn't know. His kindness had led her home to the daughter she'd thought was lost forever, to the love she'd never believed she deserved, to the understanding that family wasn't just about blood or DNA, but about the choice to show up for each other, day after day, in all the small moments that added up to a life worth living. The little girl who'd once been abandoned to die had grown up surrounded by love in all its forms, proof that sometimes the universe conspires to heal what seems permanently broken, and that the strongest families are often the ones that choose each other against all odds and refuse to let go. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Not attraction exactly, though he was undeniably handsome in a way that spoke of character rather than genetics. It was something deeper than that. The way he'd offered help without calculation, the gentle patience he'd shown with his daughter, the dignity with which he'd handled his obvious financial struggles. Rachel had met plenty of men since Sophia's death, but they'd all wanted something from her. Access to her wealth, connection to her success, association with her rising star. David Thompson had looked at her and seen someone who needed help, then provided it without asking for anything in return. When was the last time anyone had done something for her without an agenda? Pulling into her building's underground garage, Rachel sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. She thought about David's empty wallet, about the way he'd chosen gas over milk, about the practiced cheer with which he'd turned deprivation into adventure for his daughter. Tomorrow she could find them again. Phoenix wasn't that big, and she had resources that could locate anyone. She could anonymously pay their bills, set up a trust fund for Lily's education, ensure that David never had to choose between necessities again. But something about that felt wrong, like charity that would rob them of dignity rather than restore it. David Thompson didn't seem like someone who wanted to be rescued, particularly not by a woman in designer clothes who lived in a world he'd probably never seen. Still, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting had been more than coincidence. Something about Lily's intense stare, about the way the little girl had studied her face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Something about the whole encounter felt like the beginning of a story rather than a random chapter. As she rode the elevator to her penthouse, Rachel made a decision that surprised her. Tomorrow she would find David Thompson again, not to throw money at his problems, but to understand why a stranger's kindness had affected her more than years of professional success. She would find them again because something told her that their story was just beginning, and for the first time since Sophia's death, Rachel Martinez was curious about what came next. Rachel spent the next morning doing something she hadn't done in years. She drove aimlessly through Phoenix searching, not for business opportunities or investment properties, but for a man and his daughter who had somehow lodged themselves into her thoughts like splinters she couldn't extract. She'd started at the Shell station where they'd met, hoping David might return for more gas, but the teenage cashier just shrugged when she described them. Her search led her through neighborhoods she'd forgotten existed during her climb to the top. Working-class areas where chain-link fences protected small yards filled with children's toys and vegetable gardens, where laundry hung on lines because dryers were luxuries, and where pickup trucks like David's weren't fashion statements, but necessary tools for survival. It was Elena, her assistant, who finally provided the breakthrough. Rachel had reluctantly asked her to run a discreet search, claiming it was for a potential charity initiative. David Thompson works security and landscaping, has a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, Elena had reported within 2 hours. Lives at Desert Palms Apartments on Camelback Road, night shift security at Stewart Industries, weekend landscaping crew with massive Verd lawn care. Rachel found herself parked outside Desert Palms at 3 in the afternoon, feeling like a stalker but unable to drive away. The complex was tired but clean, the kind of place where people worked hard to maintain dignity despite circumstances that made every month a financial calculation. Children played in the small courtyard while parents watched from plastic chairs, and the sound of their laughter carried on the desert wind like music she'd forgotten how to hear. She was about to leave when she spotted them. David emerged from one of the ground-floor apartments, work boots laced tight, carrying a lunch cooler that had seen better years. But it was Lily who made Rachel's breath catch. The little girl was skipping beside her father, that same purple dress from yesterday, but paired with different shoes, her dark curls catching the afternoon sunlight like they were spun from something precious. Rachel watched David lock their door with the careful attention of someone who understood that security meant more than just turning a key. He checked it twice, then helped Lily into the passenger seat of his truck with the practiced efficiency of single parenthood. But before he could walk around to the driver's side, Lily had spotted Rachel's Tesla. The little girl pressed her face against the passenger window, her expression shifting from curiosity to something that looked almost like recognition. She said something to her father that Rachel couldn't hear, but David's head turned toward the Tesla with obvious confusion. Rather than drive away like every rational part of her brain suggested, Rachel found herself getting out of her car and walking toward them. David's posture shifted slightly, protective instincts clearly activated by the sight of an expensively dressed woman approaching his daughter without explanation. "Rachel?" David's voice carried surprise and wariness in equal measure. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood," she lied, then immediately felt foolish for the obviousness of it. "I wanted to thank you again for last night, and to see if there was any way I could return the favor." David studied her with those honest brown eyes, and Rachel felt like he was seeing through her carefully constructed explanation to something more vulnerable underneath. "That's kind of you," he said carefully, "but unnecessary. I told you last night, helping people is just what you do." "Hi, Rachel." Lily's voice called from inside the truck, and when Rachel looked over, the little girl was waving with the enthusiasm of someone greeting an old friend rather than a stranger she'd met once. "Hello, Lily," Rachel replied, moving closer to the truck window. "That's a beautiful dress." "Thank you. Daddy says purple is the color of royalty, so when I wear it, I'm a princess." Lily's smile was radiant, but there was something in her eyes that made Rachel's skin prickle with unexplained recognition. "She's not wrong," Rachel said, then looked back at David. "Are you heading to work?" "Yeah, evening shift starts at 4. Lily comes with me until Mrs. Chun next door gets home from her job. Then Lily stays with her until I finish at midnight." The logistics of single parenthood laid bare, the careful choreography required to ensure a child was never alone, while still earning enough to keep them housed and fed. Rachel felt a familiar tightness in her chest, remembering her own childhood, when her father had worked similar schedules to build his construction business from nothing. "Mrs. Chun is nice," Lily announced from the truck. "She teaches me Chinese words and makes soup that tastes like hugs. But sometimes she falls asleep during cartoons because she works really hard too." David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Rachel recognized the expression of a parent who wished he could provide better, but was doing the absolute best he could with available resources. She'd seen the same expression on her father's face during the lean years before his business had taken off. "What kind of work do you do at Stewart Industries?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious despite knowing she could have found the information with a simple phone call. "Security guard," David replied with no shame in his voice. "Night watchman, really. Make sure nobody steals the equipment, keep an eye on things. It's quiet work, gives me time to study." "Study for what?" "Business degree," he said, then seemed to catch himself, as if admitting ambition was somehow presumptuous. "Online classes through ASU. Taking it slow since I can only manage 1 or 2 courses at a time, but eventually I'd like to start my own security consulting firm." Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Here was a man working night security and weekend landscaping, raising a daughter alone, and still finding time to pursue education that might lead to something better. The determination it must take, the sheer exhaustion of balancing everything. made her own complaints about 18-hour days seem trivial. "That's impressive," she said, meaning it. "Business degree while working full-time and raising Lily. That takes real dedication." David shrugged, uncomfortable with praise.